Pork belly is on the menu today, and we have found a fascinating recipe from the 18th century cookbooks. Something very, very different from the standard way of cooking today. It's going to be amazing. Thanks for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. So today's recipe is fascinating not only because of the cut of meat we're using, but the cooking technique. And the technique here is called collaring, which has to do with rolling the meat up tight and tying it and boiling it. It's something that not only cooks the meat, but it's kind of a short-term preservation technique. Very, very interesting. So this collaring method is something that shows up in 17th century cookbooks, 18th century cookbooks, and then it kind of disappears and we don't see it today at all. So this one's from Powell's Book of Cookery. There's about 10 collaring recipes in here. This one is called For Collaring Pork. Take a belly piece of pork, bone it, season it high with pepper, salt, and spice, and a good handful of sage shred. Roll it tight as before directed. Boil it 5 hours in the same pickle as for the veal before. Serve it with mustard and some sugar. That is one interesting recipe. I've never seen anything quite like this. This is truly fascinating. Let's get started. So when I'm looking at these recipes, I'm always careful about what the words are actually saying. And in this recipe, it talks about the shredding of this sage. So, I'm chopping it up, but maybe I should be pulling it apart and shredding it. But I really like the section where it's talking about highly spicing this piece. So part of the preservation technique is not only the wrapping it up, but it's also the high spices that is going on inside of this. And spices, it just says spice, doesn't it? Well, what they probably mean is what we made in a few episodes ago, kitchen spice. So that's what we're gonna be using in our recipe today. Our pork belly is highly spiced. It's ready for the next stage, which is rolling it up and binding it. And these recipes call for using tape, a wide course tape, not string. We want it to sort of hold it together better. So I've got my strings already laid out, or my tape, as it were. We're gonna set our pork belly right on it. Let me arrange our tape just a little bit. There we go. And I'm going to roll this up. Okay, very interesting looking, isn't it? Now we just have to get this tied up, bind it tightly. Before we go on any further, I did want to talk about the cut of meat just for a second. In the recipe, she calls for boning it, but she doesn't talk about taking any of the fat off. She doesn't talk about taking the skin off, and that's why we've left it. And I think one of the reasons why we see the skin not coming off is because this collaring method wouldn't work right if we didn't have the skin on. It wouldn't hold together. It would just pull right through that fat. There isn't a whole lot more to a pork belly, so without the skin, I don't think it would work right. So our pork belly is prepared. It's got a great look to it, and it's got all those spices in it. It should be incredible. So our next step is our pickling solution for our pork belly to boil in. And it comes from a different recipe, a few recipes back. This one starts with boil it in a white wine vinegar and water. whole cloves and mace and a bunch of sweet herbs and a slice or two of lemon. There we go. That's our pickling solution. So we've got water, we've got vinegar, and we've got our sweet herbs. We need to prepare our nosegay, or our little bunch of herbs that we're going to tie together. So you might remember the recipe actually calls for white wine vinegar, but obviously the vinegar I poured in was not white wine vinegar. We are using malt vinegar, which is actually very similar to the white wine vinegar of the 18th century. That's why we used that one. We want to add water in until it just covers the top. And we will boil this with the top on. We want to keep as much of this pickle here as possible. So the next step is just a few more spices that we drop in, and then it's ready to go on the fire. So the last spice we've got here is mace. And normally I would put nutmeg in at this point, but I'm not going to cheat. I'm just going to use the mace, which is related to nutmeg. Just need a little bit of that right here in the solution.
John, the recipe doesn't call for nutmeg.
Shh, they'll never know. So this particular pork belly we boiled for about 2 hours, and you know, depending on the size of your pork belly, you might have to boil it longer. The recipe actually mentions 5 hours. I'm not sure what would have been left after 5 hours, so we stopped at 2 hours on this one. But if you got a really big one, maybe it will take 5 hours. You know, and if we look at this cut of meat, a pork belly, or they might have referred to this as bacon in the 18th century. They used that term a little more loosely than we do. And that was the least expensive cut. If somebody had meat, maybe bacon was the only thing they were able to buy. Pork belly here. Now, there's a lot of fat. There's skin, there's fat, then there's the meat part of this pork belly. Most likely in the 18th century, they probably would have eaten the whole thing. She certainly doesn't talk about taking the fat off in our recipe, or he or she, the author. So we've got a choice though today. We can eat whatever part we want, and some people will like the whole thing. I'm going to try out a piece right now. So good. So the spices, incredible. Very tender. A lot of really, really flavorful spices coming through in this. And obviously we used our spice mix, and we had sweet herbs boiling with it, and we've got the salt and pepper. This has tremendous flavor, and we should expect a lot of flavor. All that fat brings in lots and lots of flavor. So this is probably one of the most flavorful meats you will ever have. It's tremendous. I love experimenting with recipes just like this that we don't do today, and it was so good. If you'd like more episodes just like this, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you actually get notifications. Hey, and we have a live stream every Friday at 4. We have a great time in that live stream. Lots of fun, so make sure to check that out. Thanks for watching today.